Hey there, and welcome to your second set of culture lectures for you to listen to at home. This set is on language. This is the first of 3 parts of your language material that you will need to understand. This is Ms. Grandquist again, and some of you mentioned last time that I might have spoken a little too quickly every so often during the presentation, so I will try to slow down. I will warn you that I may not be very successful because, well, I talk fast, but I'll do my best. So, talking about language. We looked at this in our previous presentation, the idea that language is one of the easiest ways to identify groups of people. We know that we have, some 6,000 languages around the world, and it is a way that culture is passed from one culture to the next. Now, when we start talking about those languages and start looking at how many people actually speak them, we see that a lot of those 6,000 languages are spoken by very small groups of people. Our dominant languages in the world are Mandarin Chinese, Spanish, English, and Arabic. In terms of the number of people who speak those languages. When we look at specific language terms, we're going to start with, of course, the term language. And a language simply refers to a tongue or means of communication that cannot be mutually understood by someone who speaks a different language, unless, of course, they learn the language you're talking. All right, so Mandarin Chinese and Spanish are not mutually understood unless the people learn each other's language. When we're talking about languages, we also want to differentiate between official languages and vernacular languages. An official language is one that a country has said, this is our official language. This is the language of government, of education, of everyday commerce, etc., etc. And this is what we have chosen to do. The U.S., as we know, does not have an official language. There are many people in the U.S. who would like there to be an official language, but we currently do not have one. A vernacular language, then, is one that is simply used in everyday life. So it's used in the home and on the street and with friends talking to each other. That's a vernacular language. A dialect is a subset of another language. It is a form of that language, a variation of the language. Sometimes we can talk about ethnic variations, or we could talk about religious variations, or we could talk about regional variations. And it is distinctive in vocabulary and in pronunciation, but the general structure of the language remains the same. A pidgin language happens through diffusion. You're going to have 2 groups from different languages come together, and in order to communicate, they are going to create a pidgin language that will allow them to have at least basic communication for commerce, for day-to-day activities. And this is going to be a language that has a fairly small vocabulary in comparison to the languages that it came from. Spanglish would be an example of a pidgin language, and Swahili started as a pidgin language, but then later became a Creole language. A Creole language, then, is a pidgin language that has grown up, and it has become much more complex. It has become actually the mother tongue of a particular group of people, and it has developed complexity in grammatical structure, vocabulary, etc. A lingua franca is a language that has spread over a wide area where it is not the mother tongue. So it came from the term Frankish tongue, meaning the language of the Franks. When we go back to Charlemagne and his conquest of large parts of Europe, they made French, basically, or the language of the Franks, the version of French that they spoke, a lingua franca, a language that people would people who spoke different languages would learn this language in order to communicate with one another. Our best example of a lingua franca today is Swahili, and it's used throughout many parts of Africa. Okay, so looking at this, we can see on the left a shopping center in Kenya, and we can see both English words and Swahili words on the sign. These are the two official languages of Kenya, Swahili and English. Swahili, which we know is a Creole language and a lingua franca, developed along the coast of eastern Africa. English came to Kenya during the British colonial period. Now, when a language comes through colonialism, it is going to spread hierarchically. So it's going to spread from one important area, usually an urban area, to another important area, usually an urban area, or from important people to important people. And so there are large areas of the country that English never really got to, and or only got to very late, and that's the hierarchical diffusion. The vernacular language, then the language that was spoken day to day by people, spreads contagiously. So we can look at that difference in language spread. Often after colonialism ended, the colonial language was chosen to be one of the official languages, so that if they had multiple ethnic groups within the country, they would not put one ethnic language over another ethnic language, and thereby they hoped to avoid conflict between those two groups or multiple groups. Canada is a slightly different situation. Canada has recognized numerous minority languages, especially French. The province of Quebec has French as its official language. It even has language police that try to maintain French as the only really visible language that can be seen in Quebec. And so it's an interesting situation where French is part of the identity of one part of the country, and so they protect that language there. So when we talk about English as being a language, what we say then is obviously it should be mutually understood by all the people who speak English. So let's take a look at some variations of English here. Top left, we have a sign outside a London tube, the London subway. And they are saying that if you do this thing called busking, that you could be charged with a 200-pound fine. So how many of you out there know what crime that would be that you could be charged with? All right, on the bottom left, we have a Scottish word, blether, and it gives the definition underneath. On the bottom right, we have from the Northumbrian dialect of English, we have a Scrabble game, and then above that, top right, we have some Australian dialect. So if you take a look at all of this, what you notice is there's a lot of vocabulary that is not common to our form of English. Busking, for example, means that person standing there playing the guitar with their hat or guitar case out in front of them, asking you to throw tips in as you go by. Very common in America and in England. All right, the blether means to chatter, all right, and somebody who chatters a great deal. If we look at the terms on the Scrabble game, we see things like netty means toilet, canny means good, all right, and those, you can look at the rest of the terms in the notes if you want. Going up to the Australian one, a lot of it has to do simply with pronunciation. So, good on you, mate, means good on you, mate being friend, all right. Have a go, you mug. Have a go, you mug. So what we're really seeing here is that there's differences in pronunciation and differences in vocabulary, but those still allow them to be considered one language because all of it still uses the same grammatical structure and the same general format of the language. All right, a little bit more. Here we can see even in North America, there's a great deal of variation between our versions of English. So these are kind of the top 10 variables that differentiate Americans and Canadians. So almost all Americans say that you would be going to first grade. Almost all Canadians say that you go to grade 1. Do you eat a candy bar or a chocolate bar? Do you get water from the faucet or from the tap? Is the last letter in the alphabet Z or Z? Do you live in a studio apartment as your first apartment when you leave your home, or a bachelor apartment? Do you go to the ATM or a bank machine, etc., etc., etc.? All right, and so these are all things, again, it's mainly vocabulary, and so the languages still end up being almost completely mutually understood. except for, as I told my classes, when I had to translate from the Australian woman to the guy behind the counter because he couldn't understand her when she said she wanted macaroni and cheese. And so I was translating English to English. But in general, these are considered to be mutually understood languages. Then we look at kind of how do we determine where one dialect begins and one dialect ends. And here we're going to get into looking at the borders between using different words. And so on our top left, you can see that we are looking at a group of words that have been chosen. Generally, these are going to be the words that are used to describe particular features or particular activities, and these are the easternmost and northernmost borders of where the words are used. So the words are used west and south of where the lines are. What we do then with these borders, which we call isoglosses, the isogloss is the border between the use of two words, is we put a bunch of them together and we say, okay, so we can put a bunch of these isoglosses together and create a bundle of isoglosses. And therefore, we can create kind of a general sense of where one dialect ends and another dialect begins. Then looking at the map on the bottom right, we're going to see that we can say, okay, if we do that all over the United States, we're going to get some general variations of dialect throughout the United States. And it's done in the same way. And so it's not that on one side of the line people speak all one way, and on the other line they speak all the different way. These are very generalized lines, and we're not going to have hard borders here between the dialects. We are going to have what we will call in the political unit frontiers. And a frontier is just kind of a soft border where you kind of fade into speaking another way rather than having a hard line. So our English dialects in the United States, we have at least 3 and sometimes up to 8, depending on how you are counting them. And most of them developed in the early years before the American Revolution and then have kind of spread out and done some adaptations since then. So our first people coming here from England, since we're looking at the English dialect, came from the south of England, especially from London, and so we were going to see that our first settlements probably had that kind of dialect. Then we have people move in from northwestern England and the Scots-Irish coming in to the mid-Atlantic region, and so again we're going to have then a different form of English. Now, the big thing that happens to American English that changes it from being those kinds of British English, the first thing that happens is isolation. We are isolated from Britain by an ocean, and so therefore isolation, as we know, is going to cause change. The second thing that happens is we run into a lot of things we didn't have in England, and therefore we have to come up with new words or we have to adopt words from other cultures. So we start by adopting words from the Native American cultures. Bayou, caribou, moose, pecan, things like that. Then slaves coming in from the Caribbean and Africa brought words like barbecue, canoe, hurricane, gumbo, okra, yam. We interacted with the Spanish and the Southern Native Americans and got coyote, shark, tomato, and chocolate. New immigrants, Germans, Irish, Scandinavians, Italians, Jews, etc., brought even more words to this English language. And so English, which already was kind of a mix of other languages, became even more of a mix of other languages as we adopted all of these different terminologies. What we see now as kind of being the standard American dialect actually is kind of a blend of the Northern and Midland dialect. And it has become the standard Midwestern American sound and is usually what we hear on the radio and on the television and in movies is some variation of that particular dialect. It is much less likely that we will hear distinct Northern and distinct Southern dialects, we go with this kind of standard American. And that's pretty common. If you go to England, you hear British received pronunciation used, and simply that's the dialect that is used on the BBC, and therefore that is the dialect that more and more people in Britain have been moving toward. Okay, so here you can see plotting the use of particular terminologies. And so looking at the South, for example, we could, looking at our top map, we could perhaps create kind of an isogloss between the use of croaker sack or toe sack and create this idea area that's kind of a particular usage of a particular vocabulary term. If we then tried to blend that with what you call a dragonfly, whether it's a mosquito hawk or a snake doctor or whatever, and then we would create a new isogloss, we could try to kind of figure out where that dividing line between the Midland dialect and the Southern dialect is based on the usage of these kinds of vocabulary terms. If you're interested, this little link here off to the side, pop versus soda, you can go look at what people call various soft drinks in the United States, and I think you can even vote and be counted for what you call soft drinks. This is just a more detailed version of our overall dialect, and you can see that this has gotten a lot more specific. So we're looking at very specific dialects in New England and in the South, but notice that the West is still all kind of the same thing, and that's basically that mix between the Midland and the Northern that has blended out to be kind of this standard American dialect. Toponyms. Toponyms, whatever you want to say. Basically understand it as place names. What do we call places? It's a good way to look at sequent occupants. It's a good way to look at what we call places and what other people before us have called places, and therefore a way that we can understand cultures and understand what they have left behind. So there's a bunch of different kinds of toponyms. You don't have to memorize all of these. Once you see one, you'll really understand how it works. Descriptive, associative, etc. So a descriptive toponym is simply one that describes things. So like the Rocky Mountains. An associative toponym is one that is going to associate this place with something else. So Mill River, there was a mill on the river. Or Spring Field, there's a spring in that field. That's all it is. An incident name, this is relating it to something from history. So you would have Battle Creek, for example. A possessive name, well, that means that they just stick somebody else's name in front of it. So Castro Valley, Pittsburgh, because there was a guy named Pitts. Commemorative, it's in honor of someone. So we can look at St. Louis, San Jacinto, Houston, Seattle, Austin, Pennsylvania, Illinois. All of these were named in honor of a person or of groups. It could be in praising the place, commendatory, meaning, oh, this is such a great place to live, Pleasant Valley. It could be manufactured, something that's made up, like Tessness, which is sunset spelled backwards, or that kind of thing. It could be mistaken, so that they actually made a historical error. Something like the West Indies, which are not to the west and are not the Indies. The shift names, where they took names from where they had been and brought them with us. So Paris, Texas, New Mexico, New Jersey, etc. All of those kinds of things. So this is just a map of Pennsylvania where you can kind of look at it and see what toponyms you can find on here, and look for some of those examples that you saw on the previous one. So one of the ones I see right now, I see Quakertown, so that gives me an idea of what that was named after. Frenchtown. We can look at Bethlehem, obviously a relocation. We can look at let's see, what's another? Shoemakersville, that's a fun one. Hamburg, obviously a relocation. And so just take a few minutes and look at this and see what other possible examples of the toponyms you can see. And now you can do the same thing with Texas. So taking a look at Texas, let's see what it was. Oh, El Dorado, that's a nice one. Big Lake, okay, that gives us an example of what's going on there. Sterling City, Camp Wood. All right, so let's see if there's anything else down here that's Sugarland. For any of you who don't know, Houston Sugarland is where the Imperial Sugar Factory is, and it does not smell very good. Grapeland, Centerville. Oh, here we have some nice relocation ones. Athens, Corsicana, those are good. Yeah, again, just take a couple minutes, see what you can see in terms of different areas. Anything like look for maybe a commemorative one in honor of people. I see Robert Lee, that kind of thing. Okay, so this is the end of our first section of the language lectures. You will need to try to get to the other 2 lectures by the end of the week, and have a great evening. If you have any questions, of course, talk to your teachers in class. Bye-bye.